In this episode, we're going to talk about James, and John. Yes, two Jameses. One is John's older brother and was executed by Herod Agrippa at the end of our last episode. The other is the brother of Jesus. In our previous episode, we saw how the Herods were a family of client kings. They ruled the Holy Land during the era of Jesus and the early church. Basically, the Herods were kept in power by Rome to do Rome's bidding. At the end of the episode, Herod Agrippa, grandson of Herod the Great, died suddenly in 44 AD when God judged him for impiety. However, only several months before his sudden death, Agrippa had executed James, the brother of John, and imprisoned Peter to appease the Jews. Peter escaped from death due to the intervention of an angel, but James was the second martyr of the young church and the first of the 12 apostles to be martyred. This was all 44 AD. We've talked quite a bit about Peter and Paul, so it's time to finish the backstories of the other leaders of the early church, James, and John. Let's start with the brothers, James and John. James was John's older brother. Notice how James is always named first. We talked a lot about the brothers in episode 10 when introducing Peter. To recap the story, James and John, like the brothers Andrew and Peter, were from the north of Israel called Galilee. Well, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, along with their fathers, were partners in a small fishing venture on the Sea of Galilee, based out of Capernaum on the northwest coast of the lake. These four brothers were also the first four disciples Jesus called. Andrew and John were actually disciples of John the Baptist before becoming disciples of Jesus. There's another detail that isn't certain but is worth mentioning. James and John's mother was Salome, who was quite possibly the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. If this is the case, then James and John were the first cousins of Jesus. Again, we can't be certain, but there is enough textual evidence to be relatively confident. In the gospel narrative, we hear the same trio named over and over: Peter, James, and John. Those three of the four fishing partners form the inner trio of Jesus' disciples, whom Jesus keeps near at some of the most critical moments of his ministry, such as the transfiguration and the agony in the garden when Jesus is arrested. And again, we don't know why Andrew wasn't part of the inner group. Jesus gave James and John the nicknames Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, probably referencing their aggressive personalities. For instance, in Luke 9, they asked Jesus to rain fire from heaven to destroy a village that rejected Jesus. In Matthew 20, they have their mother ask Jesus if they can have positions of privilege in the kingdom, one at his right hand and one at his left hand. The other 10, understandably, did not appreciate the request. Now, you might have picked up on something if you've been a Christian for a while. In the book of Acts and Paul's letters, Peter, James, and John are still mentioned as pillars of the early church. However, they are typically references to a different James, the brother of Jesus. Why was James, the brother of John, replaced with James, the brother of Jesus? Because of Herod Agrippa. It is 44 AD, a little over a decade after the crucifixion. The ruler of Judea is Herod Agrippa, the grandson of the more famous Herod the Great, the Herod who tried to kill baby Jesus in the Christmas story. Acts chapter 12 begins. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that this met with approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. In just one verse, James, the brother of John, is gone. Agrippa executed James to appease his Jewish subjects. We can tell that James was considered a leader in the early church because he was one of the two apostles Agrippa arrested along with Peter. James was executed, but Peter was miraculously saved by an angel who led him from prison. Peter seems to have left Jerusalem and started his mission work around this time, likely to avoid Agrippa. He probably evangelized in Turkey and Greece and ended up in Rome. However, he returned to Jerusalem at least once in his life. We'll save the rest of Peter's story for another time. James was the second martyr after Stephen and the first of the 12 apostles to be martyred. His early death explains why James wasn't more of a figure in the early church. Several traditions grew up around James's life that are not attested to in the biblical text. One tradition is that James traveled to Spain to preach the gospel, after which he returned to Judea and was martyred. James's body was then taken back to Spain, where his remains are held in Santiago de Compostela in northwest Spain. Due to this tradition, James is the patron saint of Spain. For the past millennia, the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, known as the Way of St. James, has been one of the most popular Christian pilgrimages. For James's brother John, he had a completely different story. While James was the first of the 12 apostles to be martyred, John was the only one of the 12 not to be martyred. John died in 98 or 99 AD in his 90s. He was the youngest of the 12 disciples and lived a very long life. He saw more of the development of the church than any other human. John was one of the 3 principal authors of the New Testament. Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts, wrote 28% of the New Testament. Paul, in his letters, wrote 24%, and John, who wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation, wrote 20%. Since John lived for so long, he will be part of our story for quite a few more episodes, so we can leave his story there for now. Lastly, James, the brother of Jesus. After James's execution and Peter leaving Jerusalem after miraculously escaping prison, James, the brother of Jesus, was the de facto leader of the church in Jerusalem. And this is actually an amazing fact. The gospel records that Jesus' brothers, which includes James, did not believe in Jesus during his earthly ministry. It was only after James received a resurrection appearance from his brother Jesus that James became a follower. And a little over a decade later, James is the leader of the church in Jerusalem, the mother church. So the early church has a lot going on. Persecution is growing, and Gentiles are starting to follow Jesus. While the Gentiles are accepted as legitimate believers, there is a giant question about how to integrate them into a church that is still predominantly ethnically Jewish, because Jews don't share fellowship with Gentiles who are not circumcised and don't keep kosher. In this context, James, the brother of Jesus, writes the New Testament book that bears his name. The book of James could have been written as early as 45 AD, making it the earliest book of the New Testament. At the latest, it was written in the early 50s, making it one of the earliest books written along with Paul's letters. As the leader of the mother church in Jerusalem, and with the issue of Gentiles still a lingering question, James will play a significant role in the next few years and our next few episodes.